And now we move on to Chapter 2, Social and Cultural Evolution in the Weinstein text. In Chapter 1, we defined social change, or I should say Weinstein defined social change. In Chapter 2, he discusses what theory best explains it. And before we get into classic evolutionism, which is what he starts talking about, I'd like to briefly go over the three basic theories in sociology that explain human interaction. The primary reason, of course, is that evolutionary theory comes from one of them. So, there are three main theories in sociology. Hopefully you remember that from Soc 101. The first, most popular, is conflict theory. The conflict perspective in sociology is a view of society that focuses on social processes of tension, competition, and change. Modern conflict theory sees conflict amongst many groups and interests. These conflicts may involve, for example, the old versus the young, producers versus consumers, urbanites versus suburbanites, or one racial or ethnic group versus another. Conflict theorists or conflict theories assume that societies are in a constant state of change, in which conflict is in fact a permanent feature. Conflict, by the way, does not necessarily mean violence. The second main theory in sociology is the functionalist perspective. It is a view of society that focuses on the way various parts of society have functions or positive effects that maintain the stability of the whole. The best analogy is the human body. We have an interrelated set of parts, interrelated set of components, such as the head, limbs, heart, and so on. Each of these parts has a function that is a positive consequence for the whole system, in this case, ourselves, the living organism. In the same way, society has structure. Its interrelated parts are the family, religion, the military, and so on. Ideally, each of these components also has a function that contributes to the overall stability of the system. From a functionalist perspective, social change is likely to be disruptive unless it takes place relatively slowly, because changes in one part of the system usually provoke changes elsewhere in the system. And again, for my behavioral science majors, that's how we help people change. Change one tiny little bit, and it affects the whole system. Thirdly, we have the interactionist perspective. It draws much of its original inspiration from Max Weber, who emphasized the importance of understanding the social world from the viewpoint of the individual who acts in it. And we'll be discussing Max quite a bit in the course. Anyway, the interactionist perspective is concerned primarily with the everyday social interaction that takes place as people go about their lives. For our purposes here in the class, we'll be dealing primarily with conflict and functionalist theories. So let's go on, shall we? In your chapter outline, the first thing Weinstein deals with is classic evolutionism. Evolutionary theories, or classic evolutionary theories, tried to show that all societies in all spheres of social life pass through similar stages of development, moving from less complex, less differentiated stages to more complex and differentiated ones, culminating in the modern secular society. There is a significant difference between Darwinian evolutionary theory, which deals with natural selection or evolution, and sociological theories of evolution. The former, Darwin, deals with statistics, and the latter, sociology, with typologies. What is important is that both used science to explain historical development, and both believed in progressive change through science. Oh, let's see. Moving on, evolution and ecological systems. Weinstein defines evolution as a process involving the mutual and cumulative changes that occur as parts of a system interact with each other. Functionalism. He says there's a connection between the survival of populations and the environment. In fact, for a population to survive, whether it's humans in a particular place or the spotted owl, there must be some sort of a balance or equilibrium struck between them. Again, functionalism. If you overcrop or have years of drought, if you're a farmer, let's see here, and your land becomes barren or a dust bowl, you move. You have to. In the first instance, where you overcrop, you caused it. In the second, nature did. If you can't move, you die. Evolutionary theory and human populations. Weinstein introduces us to the concept of organic biological evolution. He says organic biological evolution has produced Homo sapiens. We as a species are about 250,000 years old. We evolved into what we are now about 40,000 years ago, when we saw the invention of agriculture, writing, and so on. From that point on, we differ from other animals, he says, in the social and cultural realm due to the changes in our population, size, structure, and distribution of that population. These are demographic features, and as they change, the culture of the population can change, and in turn, there is feedback on the demographics process and on survival itself. Weinstein says that the unique relationship we have with our habitat, the planet, is the result of our inheriting both biological and cultural traits. Values, language, artifacts, and customs have a life of their own. We're also at that point in our history where the mechanisms we use to adapt to the environment and any changes in the environment itself are now largely under human control. Fitness, or the adaptation and direction of evolution. He asks, are the human populations that exist today better adapted than those that are extinct? And are some existing peoples better adapted than others? And if so, what criteria do we use to identify the fittest? Well, let's see. We have some theories that might be used to look at evolution. We have first the progressive theory. Auguste Comte, by the way, believed that we could progress toward a perfect society, and that this would come about not by political revolution, but by the new moral science of sociology. He developed the law of 3 stages, which he said were not only inevitable, but irreversible. In the theological stage, and you might want to look at the handout on evolutionary theories on Blackboard. Let's see, he developed, in the theological stage, causality, or why things are, is explained through beliefs in various gods who impose their wills on objects and humanity. In the second stage, as we develop, we evolve, in the metaphysical stage, people begin to think and question the whys and wherefores of life, i.e. the Greek philosophers. Causality at this stage is explained by abstract forces, nature, not gods. And finally, in the final phase, the positive stage, people develop explanations of causality in terms of natural processes and scientific laws. At this stage in a society's development, it becomes possible to control human events. And I'm going to stop here for a moment. Thus, we are able through science to not only control our environment, but also social relations. So now we can move on to progressive theory and take a look at that. If you haven't gotten it by now, those human groups, societies, populations, cultures, nations that are the fittest today are also the most highly evolved. This is the crux of evolutionary theory. The still surviving populations with simple, homogeneous, and undifferentiated cultures, the less fit, occupy a lower position on the evolutionary scale. Organic biological evolution implies changes take eons, millions of years. Evolutionary theorists argue, therefore, that the socio-cultural changes that they have occurred because of things like race. These theories conveniently supported slavery and colonial rule. We know today there is, of course, only one human race. And I would direct you to take a look at the first measured century, especially the parts dealing with IQ and race. What is clear is that the changes we see today are not caused by organic biological evolution. They are superorganic in nature. Change isn't determined by genetic factors anymore. It can be caused by planning and social movements. Aided by electronic media, starting with the phone and radio, and now Twitter, the internet, we are now an interactive species. What is done here in Dover today can affect someone in Namibia tomorrow. Sub-lending practices could bring, or at least I was saying several years ago, that subprime lending practices could bring down economies. And by George, it happened in Iceland, for example. Okay, we're done with progressive theory. Let's move on to cyclical theory. Cyclical theories suggest that innovation leads temporarily to progress. I beg your pardon. Once again, innovation leads temporarily to progress. A dialectic sets in. New developments, unfortunately, bring deterioration. Things can only deteriorate so far before innovations once again bring progress. So we have a cycle. Over time, there is no cumulative advance or deterioration. Evolutionary forces return to the same levels as in the past. One sociological theorist, Oswald Spengler, his theory is where Western civilization was headed included successive cycles of growth, conservation, and decadence. And at this point, I would direct you to a handout that you have that I call Who's Driving the Bus. It deals with the causes of social change and the materialistic perspective versus the idealistic perspective. And basically, where's that coming from? It says, and this does fit into cyclical theory, technology causes change in material culture. Material culture changes occur more quickly than non-material cultural change, that is, values, ideas, norms, ideologies. There is therefore a period of maladjustment that comes after the technological innovation changes the culture. There is a lag, or a time lag, during which non-material culture, say religion, is still adapting to the new material conditions. Technology causes change in three ways. It increases alternatives available to society and creates new opportunities. It alters interaction patterns among people, it changes the structure of human groups, and of course it creates new problems. Economically, just a quick example, and it's not a very pleasant one, but starting in the 70s in this country, we lost manufacturing jobs, went overseas. The reason they went overseas, because it was less expensive for corporations to build a product. They could make more money. In the 80s, we started outsourcing jobs, white-collar jobs, once again. It was cheaper. We lost jobs in the 70s and 80s. In the 90s, you saw a lot more part-time work. Again, jobs were outsourced. What does this mean? Well, what it means is, in the last 4 decades, whilst we have lost jobs and our standard of living has stagnated, in the rest of the world, the world has created about 300 million, possibly 400 million middle-class people that were previously quite poor because all of these jobs and industries moved elsewhere. Okay, so causes of social change. The other perspective, again looking at your handout, is the idealistic perspective, such as ideas, beliefs, ideologies. And this comes straight from Max Weber. In essence, values and beliefs, both religious and secular, have decisive impact on shaping social change. He, for example, makes a very strong argument surrounding Protestantism. Catholicism, as I'm sure you're aware, is the largest Christian denomination within the Christian religion, and was, of course, the only choice. I guess we had Eastern Orthodox, but basically we had Catholicism up to the Protestant Reformation, I beg your pardon. Although I imagine if you were a Protestant back then, it was probably a revolution. Okay, Weber argued that the values of Protestantism, especially Calvinism, and related factors, Lutheranism, whatever, produced a cultural ethic which sanctified work and worldly achievement. It encouraged frugality and discouraged, initially, consumption. Unintended consequences of this religious worldview, this essentially worldly aestheticism, encouraged the development of large pools of capital through encouraging work, savings, and non-frivolous consumption. It also encouraged rational reinvestment and economic growth. Work became a religiously sanctioned calling. Each man is a moral free agent, accountable only to God, suspicious of material consumption beyond bare necessities, believing it led to moral corruption. Simplistically put, if you were a Catholic, your primary motivation was to serve the church, and if that is in fact the case, you put yourself second. Along comes Martin Luther and Calvin, and suddenly you have a direct contact with God. You don't need the church, therefore you can concentrate now on yourself and the here and now. I hope that's a simple explanation. In Catholicism, work is merely, Catholicism back then, 1600s, is merely a mundane activity to keep one alive, encouraging other worldly aestheticism where the highest form of activity was devotion to God. In fact, you may or may not be familiar with the term, but life is but a vale of tears. This is what Catholicism taught. Life on earth as we know it today is not meant to be enjoyed. Your reward comes in the afterlife. The Protestant Reformation completely changed that. Something that we need to know, perhaps. Okay. Reminding you, I sort of went off on a tangent, that we're still dealing with cyclical theory. Spengler and other theorists believed that economic forces such as capitalism or socialism were driving these cycles. And to refresh your memory, the cycles with Spengler were growth, conservation, and decadence. By the way, it's not on the test, but again, the whole idea with any theory that originates under evolution is that you have an orderly process and orderly progress. Moving further into dealing with cyclical theory, Petrim Sorokin, a Russian sociologist who emigrated to the United States in 1923 and founded the Department of Sociology at Harvard, suggested that societies evolve within their cultural limits of beliefs and practices. The conflict or interaction of the material world and the non-material world. He said that the future follows the past. The future follows past patterns and is cyclical. As time passes, cultures pass through alternative periods where ideas or materialism dominate. Thus my little tangent earlier and the handout. The direction a culture is going in is determined by one or the other, but not at the same time. His theory basically implies that change is inevitable. We can't stay where we are, whether it is a conservative or progressive period, forever. Nor can we jump from one to the other. There are stages to go through. And he calls these stages sensate, where our ultimate reality is determined by material things, like our iPads, and ideational, where ideals and values lead the way. So, the stages in cyclical theory, according to Sargon, are called sensate, where our ultimate reality is determined by either material things or ideas. Borrowing from the ideational, Sorokin was a believer in helping others through planned change. He wrote a number of books on the subject, emphasizing pro-social behavior and spirituality. His basic tenet was that inequality or inequity is not set in stone. It is not hereditary, natural, or inevitable. We can change the world for the better for everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed my lecture on Chapter 2. It was a little convoluted, and I'm quite sure it's quite boring sitting there watching me. In fact, I'd probably recommend that you don't, at least listen and do the best job you can keeping up with the chapter outline. And do read the handouts. Again, if you've missed class, or if you've been to class and you're using this as a backup or refresher. Anyway, see you in Chapter 3.